A mother in Brooklyn now oversees an estate valued in the hundreds of millions, built entirely from the voice and music of the son she lost 5 years ago. Since Pop Smoke's death, Audrey Jackson has carried that responsibility alone. But the real story begins with how his estate grew after he died. Let's get straight into it. Pop Smoke, born Bashar Baraka Jackson, was murdered in February 2020. At just 20 years old, in the middle of a home invasion at a rented house in the Hollywood Hills. At the time, his money situation looked nothing like a nine-figure empire. Estimates of his net worth when he died sat around $2 million, built off 2 mixtapes and a run of singles that had just started catching fire nationally. That number did not stay put. Since his death, Pop Smoke's music hasn't slowed down, it's exploded. His posthumous album, Shoot for the Stars, Aim for the Moon, dropped months after he was killed and became one of the year's biggest releases. That album has since sold over 5 million units worldwide and debuted at #1 on the Billboard 200. His catalog has racked up billions of streams across Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and Amazon Music, and that streaming revenue keeps flowing into his estate every single month. Estimates of that estate's value have climbed steadily and inconsistently depending on who's counting. Some trackers put it at 5 to 10 million by 2023. Others have pushed the posthumous total as high as 10 million by 2024, factoring in royalties, unreleased music, brand deals, and merchandise. But the trajectory only points one way, up. A young artist who was just breaking through. When he died, left behind a back catalog that keeps generating money, years after his voice went silent. And that revenue stream is why people are now throwing around numbers in the tens of millions when they talk about what his estate could be worth going forward, factoring in future deals, licensing, and the kind of posthumous rap catalog booms that have turned other late artists into ongoing businesses. And at the center of all of it, the person actually holding the keys is his mother. Reports have described Audrey Jackson as the one Pop Smoke's wealth is inherited by his immediate family, primarily his mother, Audrey Jackson, who is reportedly the executor of his estate. There's no public record that Pop Smoke left behind a will before he died, so his assets are being handled the way unplanned estates typically are, through family oversight with his mother at the front of it. That means every deal, every re-release, every brand partnership tied to his name runs through her. She didn't get handed a stack of cash and walk away quiet. Since her son died, Audrey Jackson has been the public face of his legacy, showing up at award shows, giving interviews, launching a foundation, and building out businesses in his name. When Shoot for the Stars, Aim for the Moon won top Billboard 200 album at the Billboard Music Awards, it was Jackson who walked up on that stage to accept the trophy for her son, celebrating the life and the work he never got to see fully pay off. That's the part of this story that makes it different from a normal inheritance headline. This isn't a woman who quietly banked a settlement and disappeared into private life. Jackson runs a nonprofit. She runs a fashion line. She hosts community festivals in the same Brooklyn neighborhood where her son grew up. She sat through 5 years of a murder trial while simultaneously being the person responsible for turning her dead son's unfinished career into a functioning, growing estate. She's living publicly, deliberately, and loudly. And the money that's come with all of that has to be understood alongside everything else she's been carrying. Because here's the thing people miss when they just see a dollar figure attached to a name. The value tied up in Pop Smoke's estate isn't sitting in a bank account collecting dust. It's moving through a family that's still actively grieving, through a mother who still can't listen to her son's own songs in her car, through a legal system that only just finished sentencing the people responsible for his death. The money and the grief are tangled together in a way that's genuinely rare to see play out in public for this long. So before we get into exactly how she's living now, the mansion, the foundation, the fashion brand, the parades, we need to go back and understand how a Brooklyn kid who was thrown out of 8th grade for bringing a gun to school ended up building a catalog that would one day be valued in the tens of millions, and how his mother ended up the one steering the ship. To understand how big this got, you have to go back to where it started, because none of this looked like millions when it began. Pop Smoke grew up in Canarsie, Brooklyn, raised by his mother Audrey Jackson and his father Greg Jackson. His mother is of Panamanian descent, his father Jamaican, and the two of them raised their son in a household that, by his mother's own account, valued faith and education deeply. Audrey Jackson worked as an educator, and by her own description in later interviews, she leaned on her son's own lyrics in her work with young people, using the very words he wrote about the streets to try to reach kids still living in them. His childhood wasn't smooth. He was expelled from school in 8th grade for bringing a gun onto campus, which led to 2 years of house arrest. He bounced through 9 different schools before eventually relocating to Philadelphia to attend Rocktop Academy, only to drop out after being diagnosed with a heart murmur. This is the version of Pop Smoke that existed years before any of the money. A teenager on house arrest, cycling through schools, dealing with a serious health scare, in a Brooklyn neighborhood that gave him almost none of the safety nets that come standard for a lot of kids his age. Then, in 2018, everything changed. He started recording music, and it didn't take long before he caught the attention of 50 Cent, who helped push him into a bigger spotlight. His deep, growling voice, unlike almost anything else on the radio at the time, became the calling card of a new sound coming out of Brooklyn. His 2019 debut single, Welcome to the Party, put Brooklyn drill on a national stage, in a way it had never been before, and his debut mixtape, Meet the Woo, followed shortly after, and confirmed he wasn't a one-off. He was building something. Collaborations with artists like Travis Scott, Nicki Minaj, DaBaby, and Lil Baby started stacking up. He was 20 years old and on the edge of a real sustained career. Then it ended. He was killed during a home invasion at a rented house in the Hollywood Hills in February 2020, shot on the second-story balcony of a property where he'd been staying while promoting his upcoming music. The plan, according to prosecutors, had started as a robbery, the group targeting a gold chain and a diamond watch he'd shown off on social media the day before. It turned into a killing that ended a career before it had barely begun. What happened next is the part that turned a tragic, short career into a genuine financial engine. Months after his death, Shoot for the Stars, Aim for the Moon was released, built partly from music he'd already recorded, and partly from posthumous production and features stitched together by his team. It debuted at #1. It went on to sell over 5 million copies worldwide. And unlike a lot of posthumous rap releases that fade quickly, Pop Smoke's catalog kept performing. His tracks continued climbing streaming numbers, his sound kept getting sampled and referenced, and his name kept showing up in conversations about the most influential voices in New York drill, even years after he was gone. That's the mechanism behind the number everyone's fixated on. It's not one lump payment, it's ongoing streaming royalties, sync licensing, merchandise, and continued sales. From a catalog that's still being managed and expanded years after the artist behind it died. His family, alongside his longtime manager, Steven Vector, took on responsibility for managing that estate, deciding what gets released, what gets licensed, and how the brand around Pop Smoke continues to grow. And Audrey Jackson sat at the head of that table. She wasn't a passive next-of-kin cashing checks from a distance. She became, by nearly every account, the person steering decisions about her son's posthumous output, reportedly serving as executor of an estate that didn't come with a will or a clear roadmap, meaning every call about how to keep Pop Smoke's music and image alive fell to her, and the rest of the family to work out as they went. That responsibility came bundled with grief in a way that most executors of estates never have to deal with. Most people managing a 9-figure conversation around an artist's catalog are lawyers, managers, or label executives, with professional distance from the person who died. Jackson had none of that distance. She was approving releases and image use for a son she was still actively mourning, sitting through interviews about the value of his back catalog in the same year. She was also sitting through pretrial hearings for the men who killed him. That's the dynamic that makes the growth of this estate so different from a typical posthumous rap story. Every dollar that came in from streaming, every deal signed to keep his name commercially alive, ran through a mother who was simultaneously fighting to see justice handed down in a Los Angeles courtroom. The business and the grief were never separate. They ran on parallel tracks for 5 straight years. And while the business side kept climbing, millions of streams, a #1 album, growing estimates on what the whole catalog might eventually be worth, Jackson was also building something entirely separate from the money. She was building a public life around her son's memory, one that would come to define exactly how she's living now. Here's where the story shifts from how the money grew to what she actually did with the platform that came with it. Because Audrey Jackson didn't just manage an estate quietly from behind the scenes. She turned her son's memory into an entire operation with her name attached to almost every piece of it. The centerpiece is the Shoot for the Stars Foundation, named after her son's posthumous album. After her son's death, Jackson started the Shoot for the Stars Foundation, which celebrates the life and legacy of Pop Smoke. In her own words describing the mission, this foundation is committed to transforming the lives of young people through creative engagement, education, access to technology, and inspirational global experiences, she said. That's not a vague mission statement she outsourced to a PR team. It's language she's repeated across multiple interviews, almost word for word, because it's clearly the thing she cares most about getting across. The foundation runs actual programs, not just a website with a donate button. One initiative called Tell the Vision, named after a Pop Smoke song title, is aimed at middle and high school students, giving them a program to provide an environment where they can creatively express themselves. It's the kind of program built specifically for kids growing up the way her son did, in neighborhoods where creative outlets aren't exactly handed out. And then there's the parade. Every year around what would have been her son's birthday, Canarsie shuts down a stretch of street for a celebration built entirely around Pop Smoke's memory. Audrey Jackson, Pop Smoke's mother and founder of Shoot for the Stars Foundation, follows a mobile DJ playing her son's music, dancers, and members of the Canarsie Merchants Association in a parade along Seaview Avenue that ends at a park where a percussion group performs for everyone attending. This is a woman who could have taken the money and retreated into private life. Instead, she's out on Seaview Avenue every year in the same neighborhood that raised her son, watching floats and dancers celebrate a life that ended at 20. She's not satisfied with what it is now, either. Jackson wants the celebration to grow, saying she wants the parade to look more like a real parade, with floats and merchants carrying banners. She's also floated the idea of adding games, tennis, tag football, volleyball, to the festival that follows. This is someone actively building out a bigger production year over year, not letting it shrink into a quiet memorial. Alongside the foundation, she's built a fashion brand called Black Smoke. It's described as a project where designers collaborate with Jackson and her family to create a collection of fashion that encapsulates Pop Smoke's spirit. On Hot 97, she talked about hand-selecting a group of young designers for a collaboration, calling the results absolutely phenomenal and mentioning that the team had to bring the collection all the way to Valencia to show it to the world. That's not a local side hustle. That's an operation with international reach, run under her direction, built entirely around keeping her son's name and style alive in a commercial product. Then there's what's been referred to as the Connie Cove Mansion, a property that's come up repeatedly in interviews alongside discussions of the foundation, suggesting a physical base tied to the family's public-facing work has become part of how this whole operation runs. Between the mansion, the foundation, the fashion label, and the annual parade, Jackson has built something that looks less like a grieving mother, managing an inheritance and more like a full-time brand operation. One where every project ties back to keeping her son present in the world he was pulled out of too early. She's also made a point of using her platform to support other mothers going through the same thing she has. Back in 2021, she hosted a spa weekend in Brooklyn, specifically for mothers of hip-hop artists who lost their children to violence at a venue called the Brooklyn Estates. That event pulled in coverage from local outlets, and it's a detail that says a lot about how she's chosen to process her own loss by building community around other women carrying the exact same weight. She's shown up on major platforms to keep talking about all of it too. On the anniversary of her son's death, she sat down with the Breakfast Club alongside then NYC mayoral candidate Eric Adams, describing how surreal the experience felt, saying these moments, they're bittersweet. Here at the Breakfast Club, you guys, he would listen to you all every day. He sat in the kitchen at the table, played you all. This should have been his moment. That interview also touched on her husband's career. She's described her husband as extremely successful in the financial industry, an industry she noted is genuinely difficult for a Black man to navigate at that level. The picture that emerges is a full family unit, not just a mother alone, managing a windfall, a husband with his own established career, a brother, Obasi Jackson, who's appeared alongside her at multiple public events, discussing the foundation and the family's grief together. None of this reads like someone hoarding money quietly. It reads like someone who took whatever came from her son's growing catalog and poured a significant amount of it, time, public appearances, actual programming, into keeping his name, doing good in the world he left behind. The foundation, the fashion line, the parade, the spa weekends for grieving mothers, all of it sits on top of the financial engine that his catalog became, and none of it would have been possible without the legal fight that had to happen first, the one that consumed 5 years of her life running parallel to all of this. the fight to get justice for her son's murder. While the foundation grew and the fashion line launched and the estate kept climbing in value, there was a court case hanging over every single year of it. 4 people were involved in the home invasion that killed Pop Smoke. Getting all of them through the legal system took nearly half a decade. Corey Walker was the only adult among the defendants at the time of the crime, and his case became the centerpiece of the prosecution. He eventually accepted a plea deal, pleading guilty to voluntary manslaughter and home invasion robbery with gun and gang enhancements, expected to receive a sentence of 29 years in prison. When the deal came through, Rolling Stone reporter Nancy Dillon spoke with Jackson directly, and what she said cuts right to the core of what this whole 5-year process meant to her. "It's over for everybody except for me. This never ends for me, and that's unfair," Jackson said. She went further, describing the specific nature of grief that doesn't resolve just because a courtroom does. "I'm grateful that the culprits were caught. I appreciate they got justice to the fullest extent of the law, but my life doesn't change. I still don't have my son. I will continue to work on his legacy. But that's also a constant reminder that he's not here," she said. That last line explains almost everything about why the foundation and the fashion brand and the parade exist. Working on his legacy isn't just something she does for the public, it's simultaneously the thing that keeps him present and the thing that reminds her every day that he's gone. She made a decision that surprised some people. She chose not to attend Walker's actual sentencing hearing. After nearly 5 years of a case grinding through the system, when the moment finally came to see one of the men responsible for her son's death formally punished, she wasn't in the room. That decision says something about where she'd landed emotionally by that point, that watching one more legal proceeding wasn't going to give her anything. The plea deal itself hadn't already delivered. Walker wasn't the only person tied to the case whose fate touched Jackson publicly. Another individual involved, who goes by the name Blockstar, had pleaded guilty as a juvenile years earlier and served a 4-year sentence before being released. His release triggered backlash across social media, and it got worse when he sat down for an interview on the No Jumper podcast and reportedly expressed no remorse for what happened. Fans didn't hold back, criticizing both Blockstar and the podcast for what they saw as using Pop Smoke's death to generate attention. Jackson addressed it directly in a conversation with Hot 97's TT Torres, and her response showed a woman who'd clearly built up defenses against exactly this kind of provocation. She said she hadn't actually watched the interview herself, explaining, "I'm not tuned into that. It's not a part of my world. I have people who will come and say, 'Have you heard?' They'll hit me up and say, 'Ma, you okay?'" She went on to explain why she deliberately keeps that content at arm's length, saying, "I gotta let that go because that'll eat me up. I gotta let that go. The bottom line is your life is over. His life is finished. He's living, but if that's his approach to what he's done, life is done for him." That's a woman who has figured out, after years of practice, exactly how to protect her own peace while still remaining the public face of her son's case. She doesn't watch the interviews. She doesn't engage with the noise directly. But she also doesn't pretend it isn't happening. She processes it on her own terms, on her own platforms when she's ready to. The timing of all this legal resolution matters too. The plea deal that finally closed out Walker's case came after nearly 5 years of prosecution, meaning Jackson spent essentially the entire period her son's estate was exploding in value, also sitting through pretrial hearings, delays, and the slow grind of the California court system. She was simultaneously accepting a Billboard Music Award on her son's behalf, launching a foundation, building a fashion brand, hosting community events, and waiting for a courtroom in Los Angeles to finally deliver a sentence. Deputy District Attorney Hillary Williams handled the plea hearing itself, walking Walker through a lengthy signed agreement in front of the court, with Walker appearing in an orange jail uniform flanked by his defense attorneys. It was, by most accounts, a quiet, procedural end to a case that had generated years of headlines. And on the other end of the phone, hours later, was a mother trying to explain to a reporter that closure and grief are not the same thing. That distinction between legal closure and personal grief is really the thread that runs through every single part of this story. The estate can keep growing. The foundation can keep expanding. The fashion brand can keep collaborating with new designers. None of that changes the fact that Jackson is still, 5 years later, a mother without her son. And that reality shapes what living with this kind of inheritance actually looks like for her. So here's where all of this lands. The number attached to Pop Smoke's estate, Whatever exact figure you want to use, and estimates have ranged anywhere from single-digit millions to numbers people now throw around in the tens of millions when you factor in the full trajectory of his catalog isn't sitting in an account somewhere untouched. It's moving through a woman who spent 5 years building a public life, entirely structured around keeping her son present. Every piece of what Audrey Jackson has built connects back to the same source. The foundation exists because the money from his catalog funds it. The fashion brand exists because there's still commercial demand for anything carrying his name and style. The parade in Canarsie happens every year because the community around his old neighborhood and the resources tied to his estate make it possible to shut down a street and throw a real celebration. None of that infrastructure exists without the underlying financial engine his music became after he died. But none of it exists without her grief driving it either. That's the part that makes this different from a typical story about someone coming into money. She's described in her own words that she can't listen to his music unless she has to. Not in her car, not casually, not for pleasure. She turns on the news instead, and yet she's built her entire public identity around keeping that same music and everything tied to it alive and growing for other people to enjoy. She's living inside a contradiction that most people never have to navigate, profiting from and promoting the very thing that hurts her most to encounter directly. The scale of what she's built also keeps expanding. The foundation has moved from spa weekends for grieving mothers to structured school programs like Tell the Vision. The fashion brand has gone from a local project to international collaborations, taken all the way to Valencia. The parade has grown year over year, with Jackson pushing publicly for it to get bigger still. More floats, more merchants, more games at the festival, whatever the exact number attached to her son's estate ends up being as the catalog continues generating streams and licensing deals. The trajectory of everything she's built with it points in one direction: growth, not retreat. And the legal chapter that shadowed all of it for 5 years has finally closed, even if the emotional one hasn't. Walker is serving out a lengthy sentence. Blockstar is out and living whatever life he's chosen to live with what he did. Jackson has said her piece about both of them on her own terms without pretending either resolution gives her back what she actually lost. What she has instead is control. Control over how her son's name gets used. Control over what gets released. Control over the brand, the foundation, the parade, the fashion label. That control is the actual inheritance here. Arguably more than any specific number, she's the one deciding what Pop Smoke's legacy looks like 15, 20, 30 years from now. And she's building that legacy in real time, in public, year after year, while still carrying grief that by her own description never actually ends. Her brother Obasi has stood beside her through most of these public moments, and her husband's own career has continued to grow alongside all of this, giving the family a foundation in every sense of the word that extends beyond what Pop Smoke's catalog alone provides. This isn't a story about one woman suddenly thrust into wealth with no support system. It's a story about a family that absorbed an unthinkable loss and then spent 5 years building something out of it, brick by brick, program by program, parade by parade. The question people keep asking: how is she living with this kind of money? Maybe doesn't have a single answer. She's living in Canarsie parades and Valencia fashion shows. She's living in Hot 97 interviews and Breakfast Club appearances. She's living in spa weekends for other grieving mothers and school programs for kids who remind her of her son at that age. She's living, in other words, exactly the way she's described it herself, working on his legacy every day and being reminded every day by that same work that he's not here to see any of it. That's the actual shape of this inheritance, not a number, a routine, a mission, a mother who turned an unbearable loss into an operation.